I guess I have one question related to this topic. So, the people of Bolivia, the workers of Bolivia, they took to the streets, they understood their power, they engaged in this general strike. What can we do here in the United States to help American workers understand the power they have? I feel like that's the first step in, beginning to organize workers for a general strike. Why is there this difference between the people of Bolivia and American workers when it comes to just understanding, comprehending, and wielding the power they have?
Well, I think, it's a tough argument to make, but let me make it anyway. I think the United States, for a whole host of reasons, has been exceptional. In one way, every country is, but the United States has been exceptional. And part of the exceptional quality of the United States, I think, can answer your question. But it requires a moment of history. In the 1930s, 1929 to 1940, the American dream was destroyed. The promise of a greater standard of living, the promise of an upswing, the promise of American exceptionalism to an influx of migrants coming from around the world here had been, you will prosper. You will prosper in ways you couldn't anywhere else because this system only goes one way, up. And the truth of it was, from around 1820 to the time of the Great Depression, so a good over a century, that had been true. Real wages had risen every decade, standard of living had gone up. The so-called American exceptionalism that every generation will live better than the one before had in fact occurred. It led to an absurd inference, namely that this would go on forever, which in a way everybody knows is unlikely. But in the euphoria, it got built up. Okay, keep that moment in your mind. Here comes the crash that produces Dos Passos or John Steinbeck, or the horror of a collapsing economy all across the United States. It produced in America, and here comes the punchline, it produced in America a very different reaction from what we see today, an upsurge of the left. It even had things like the Mas Party, in the sense that the CIO worked very closely, not only with the Democratic Party and Roosevelt, but also with two socialist parties and the Communist Party. You had a coming together of the labor movement and the political operatives on the left in a way that was extraordinarily powerful. That produced the New Deal. That wasn't Mr. Roosevelt's creation. That was an upsurge from below, accompanied by endless labor demonstrations, some big strikes, and so forth and so on. Again, similar. But now you had this remarkable moment in which millions and millions of Americans, not just those in the labor movement, began to see the labor movement and this whole upsurge as the direction of the future. So people weren't scared anymore. They came out to a demonstration. They joined the picket line. They joined the union in numbers we've never seen before or since. It's extraordinary. Everybody felt they were wrapped up in a social change they could celebrate because it had immediate advantages as well as long-term possibilities. And so they did. And they got really excited in a way that is, in retrospect, innocent in terms of not understanding just what you're up against, which also may be similar to the Bolivians. So what happens? You have a coup in Bolivia, and it shakes people up, and it shakes them badly. Well, we had a coup here, too. After the great upsurge around the New Deal, you had the cherry on top of the ice cream. You had an alliance with the Soviet Union to fight fascism. It couldn't have been scripted more dramatically. Suddenly over the post office window where you buy stamps across America, there was a famous cartoon. You had Uncle Sam in his tall hat, arm in arm with Uncle Joe, a cartoon of Uncle Joe. That was Joseph Stalin that we were buying stamps under. because he was our bosom buddy. He was the glue that held it all together in the fight against the great evil, which was fascism. Well, imagine a population in that euphoria getting smashed. And I really want to hammer at this. At the end of World War II, Roosevelt dies. The alliance with the Soviet Union is no longer necessary. And the business class in this country, having been whacked by higher taxes than they had ever been seen before, by regulations they had never seen before, and the money gotten by taxing them more used to create Social Security, unemployment compensation, and a federal jobs program that hired 15 million people, and the minimum wage for the first time. I mean, it was overwhelming to them what had happened. And they went to work to undo it. And we know the details. I won't bore you with, you know them. But I want to emphasize one thing. I believe you traumatized the American people in a very deep way. The innocence with which they had risen up to fix the economy broken by capitalism in the Great Depression had been a moment of exuberance of the American people, a moment of believing you could actually make a difference. And then the coup, again, the coup. And here's the difference. The Bolivians were able to regroup. That maybe is the most important question. Why? Why were they?
Yeah.
In America, we failed. That coup killed the left, and it left, even though the generation that went through it is now gone, I believe, and I've been a professor all my life, and I see it in my students every year, there's a deep-seated anxiety in American people, often unconscious, often unverbalized, which goes something like this. When someone invites you to a demonstration, back away. If someone urges you to get involved, remember the caution your grandmother said in passing one day during your birthday party. Don't go there. That's dangerous. If you go in that direction, you will be traumatized again. And you know, psychologists teach us, if you suffer a trauma as a child, that's of course awful. But if you can never discuss it, if you can never face up to it, it becomes more awful. It does more damage to your maturation as you grow up. We've never confronted in a really systematic way what I'm talking about. It sits there below the surface and it immobilizes the left. We have a left. The left is big and it's strong and it's smart. We have the ingredients. What is lacking is the ability to overcome that psychologically preserved trauma. So we have to watch and be jealous of the folks in Bolivia for what they were capable of doing. And, you know, I see it over and over again. Let me conclude with a little story. My family, by origin, French. So I go back to France a lot. I speak French and all of that. And a few years ago, my wife and I are in a hotel in Paris. We come down from the hotel, going off to get our croissant and espresso and all of that. And there's a demonstration. And being who we are, we immediately join the demonstration and start asking people, what's this about? Well, the government has just come down with a plan to do away with the subsidies for daycare centers. And the subsidies usually cover the cost of setting it up, usually in the basement of a church. And in Paris, that means a Roman Catholic church. So who's marching? The first line of march, red banners, the Communist Party of that section of Paris. The parts of Paris are called arrondissement, and that's like a ward in the United States, in the city. And the next line of march is a row of Catholic nuns holding up a banner for whatever the name of their church is in that parish. And they're giggling and flirting with, that is, the nuns are flirting with the communists in the line ahead of them and vice versa. They all know each other. They all come from this same area. And I realize as I begin to talk with them that they're out here every few months because the government does something stupid and they don't want it. And in this case, they made an alliance that everybody understands. The church needs the money to keep going as a subsidy to rent out their basement for the daycare center. And the citizens, many of whom are anti-Catholic in the sense they're not religious, they don't go to church, but they really appreciate the daycare center that is in the church, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so they're all working together, which makes sense to everybody. And they understand that they want the labor union to come in and bring its people, which it does. And guess what? Within 3 days, we were still in Paris at that time, the government rescinded the demand. It folded. And it folded because it had to. There was no option. Let me bring it forward to right now. Over the last months of this pandemic, the United States as a society fired over 60 million people, a third of our labor force, actually a bit more. They're not all unemployed now. Some of them went back to work. 20 million or 25 million still are unemployed, but put that aside. Nothing like this happened in Europe. Nowhere. Not England, not France, not Germany, not Italy, nowhere. Why? Because of this. Because in Europe, had they dared to add to the grief of the Europeans around COVID-19 or the grief around the economic crisis that implied and produced, if they had added to that, putting a third of their labor force under the anxiety of not knowing if there would be a job when this was over, what conditions of the job would be like, if they even got one when it was, to add the anguish of unemployment on top of everything else, unspeakable. You couldn't do that in Europe. You couldn't do it in any country, whether it was governed by a socialist or a conservative. You couldn't do it, and you couldn't do it for a simple reason. Had you dared to do it, those workers fired, they wouldn't have gone home. They would have gone into the streets and shut the economy down way tighter than anything the pandemic has done or could have done. And everybody knew it. That's why they didn't dare deal with it. Unemployment in France, in Germany, for example, the most important economy, was roughly 5% when the pandemic hit. It's 6% now. You notice nobody got fired. Italy has a lower unemployment rate now during the pandemic than they did a year ago before the pandemic was even a thought in anyone's mind. So the ability to put together the people on the ground moving with the political establishment, even when you don't have an alliance with that political establishment, is powerful. Imagine then what would have happened had the socialists in Europe, a party that is atrophying everywhere in Europe, but had they not taken the direction they did, keeping separate from the social movements, keeping a distance from the social movements, the very opposite of what happened in Bolivia. Had they not done that, the possibility for what could be happening in Europe now would be spectacular. Not perhaps as spectacular as Bolivia, but at least a nice passage in that direction. I'm sorry to take so long, but
not at all.
I think
I could have listened for 2 more hours. Yeah, I mean, I look
is 100% on target, and that's why I'm blown away by this report on Bolivia. It's not just that the topic is worth it. It's just you found the moments that can be teaching for everybody.
Thank you. That's very incredibly flattering. You have no idea. I look at the United States today, and obviously we've been suffering through a very prolonged economic crisis basically since 2008. Obviously, steady decline before then. Obviously, that was hypercharged after 2008. There's the new economic crisis brought about by the pandemic. Obviously, those material conditions have led to a generation of people, basically, and in my generation, that is far more radical than our parents' generation. And we were so, I think that we were so inspired by someone like Bernie, because precisely because he had lived through so many of those struggles in the past, and we got that sense that that we were attaching ourselves to a struggle that has been happening for decades and centuries before us, that it wasn't just something new. That being said, we also are not seeing, maybe I'm not seeing it, but we are not anywhere near any position to take state power. And I think a lot of it is what you're talking about, that trauma, that sort of hesitance, that unwillingness or fear of going all the way. How do we overcome it? How do we rebuild, the actual levers of power to change something meaningful?
Well, it's an enormous question. It is the question for us. Maybe let me start by disagreeing with you on one thing. Every generation has to be allowed to find its own way. If you ask me and I give you an analysis or I give you a piece of advice, I think that's useful. I need to believe that, obviously, so I think it's useful. But I know my limits, and my limits are you on the ground have the ability, partly because of your age and all that implies, to take some steps, to make some breaks. You have to do it in your personal life. You know that. You have to leave your parents at a certain point. For some of us, very hard to do. Can spend the rest of our lives trying to do it. You have to break from relationships that are not good for you. I mean, all of that. You know all of that. And you have to break politically, too. Let me urge you, though, to do it. That the resources that exist in this country for a resurgent left are, in my opinion, enormous. You have to build on them. And how you're doing it, look, I'm taken aback by the polling. I've worked on and off in my life with Bernie Sanders. I know him, he knows me and all that. You're right. He'd been a fighter from day one. Made a decision to leave New York and go to Vermont with all the ambiguities and ambivalences that you can imagine. And he found a way. He didn't know at each step what the right way was. He wobbled between social movements and political. He ended up doing more of the political, but he remembered where he had come from, and he remembered the importance of it in a number of ways that's kind of unusual for American politics, even on the left. So yeah, he's unusual. He's the right guy at the right moment. I feel, even though I have big disagreements with him, politically and theoretically, I feel an enormous debt to him. He had the courage that almost nobody else had to do what I think was the necessary break in the trauma that you just referred to, by running and not running away from the label socialist, which was a political death warrant, suicide, political suicide for anyone roughly from 1945 to 2015. And that's a long time, almost a century, during which you had this kind of relentless, dogmatic denunciation of everything socialist. Look at how the right wing in America today uses the label socialist in a kind of frenetic hysteria almost. And what that teaches you is how deep it still exists. This is, I've been to villages in the American South, in a church, listening to people denounce socialism. And as I listened, I understood they had no idea what it was. This was a deep hostility, genuine, I don't doubt it for a minute, in which they had taken everything that was evil in their lives that they had encountered or heard about, and now packaged it very nicely as socialism. So instead of saying something was bad for this or that reason, you had a shorthand. It was socialism. What that taught me was how deep, and I began to recognize it in people who were ostensibly open-minded, who were liberal, and who were genuinely so, and didn't want to pejoritize everything. But underneath the level of their discourse, very similar hysterias were being tapped. It's a little bit like listening to Democratic politicians that I know personally rail at me about the Russian manipulation of our. What are you talking about? What's the matter here? Russia manipulates our election? Of course it does. Russia manipulates elections all over the world. And they learned it from the United States, which does it. I mean, this is nutty what is going on here, beyond the details of what's exactly right and what isn't. There's a kind of generalized, deep, dispersed nuttiness that we have to get over. And I don't know how to do that with your generation, other than what you are now doing. Having this program, producing what the new social media allow us to produce, not worrying when someone says to us, oh, you're preaching to the choir. As any good minister in any denomination has long learned, the choir needs it too. And don't worry about that. Developing your choir is developing the people who go out into the community and then become the movers and the shakers, in part because what they've learned in the moment of the choir practice when the minister and the choir have their interactions. So for me, doing what we're doing will find the way as we go. The crucial thing, and maybe this is the answer you were looking for, who knows? Don't give up. Don't give up. Don't stop. Don't let anyone stop you. Keep looking. You're going to make mistakes? Of course you are. And you will be embarrassed occasionally. Someone will catch you in a way your wish took over your thought or your enthusiasm. The crucial thing, don't stop. Let me be personal about it for a moment. It's a long, complex story, but my parents were immigrants. My father French and my mother German. And I was born here in the United States. I was born in Youngstown, Ohio, which, by the way, is a wonderful case study for collapse of capitalism. If you ever want to see it, just go there and look at the empty factories and all the rest. But because of all of this, I went to the very elite universities of the United States. I went to Harvard, then I went to Stanford, and I finished at Yale. It's like a joke. I'm a poster boy for all of that kind of stuff. And here's what my education amounted to. With the exception of one professor, during one semester at Stanford, I was 10 years in the Ivy League. From my freshman year at Harvard to my PhD in economics at Yale, I was 10 years in this situation. And I majored in economics. That's what I have my PhD in. At no time in those 10 years in the Ivy Leagues was I assigned, with one exception in one semester, one word of the mature work of Karl Marx. Why is that interesting? Well, Marx was and remains, the Marxian tradition too, the most developed, sophisticated accumulation of practical and theoretical work that is critical of capitalism and wants to do better. Okay, you don't have to agree with it, but it's an enormous body of work. When Marx dies in 1883, that's 150 years ago, roughly, his ideas spread to every country on this planet in 150 years. A stunning, I mean, you can't find that anywhere in human history. That's a lot faster spread than Christianity accomplished, or Islam, or anything else of this kind. And it means something. It means that in every country, as in Bolivia, Marxism spoke to people in ways that made them excited, made them move. Every country has a Marxist political party or a Marxist journalism or Marxist, you name it, everywhere. It's a powerful, and yet when my education at Yale and at Harvard and at Stanford, nothing. I was educated in an institution that was so afraid of this Marxism that what they did was to imagine, like a baby, like a child, That if you put your hands in front of your eyes, the scary doggy who's barking at you won't be there anymore until you're supposed to mature and realize the dog stays there even if you cover your eyes. Not for us, not my generation. And let me mention to you, my classmate at Yale was Janet Yellen, who went on to be the head of the Federal Reserve. I know all these people. It's a bit of an old boy network that comes out of these Ivy League schools. Why am I telling you this? Because everything they did for those 10 years was designed to persuade me to stop thinking critically about capitalism as a system, to look at it as the gift of God to man and woman, the best thing since sliced bread, something so wonderful, so perfect, that anyone who criticizes it is either ignorant or perverse or probably both. I don't even understand why I held on. Most of my classmates, even those who came to school with some radical instincts or critical, they couldn't withstand the pressure. I had my moments of doubt too. But man, I lived in a society that did everything to make me stop. And that's why I'm urging you, don't let that happen. You are part of a critical tradition. You should be proud of it. It has moved the world forward. It will do it again. And if I had any little aphorism to end, there's a quote. I usually say it's a quote from a great political theorist or a political maneuverer. But since I'm talking to Jacobin, I know I can tell you who said what I'm about to repeat. But first, let me tell you it, then I'll tell you who said it. Okay? It goes like this. For decades, nothing seems to change.
Yeah.
And then in a few weeks, decades happen. Lenin.
Yeah.
That's how Lenin answered the impatience you just articulated. How do we do? How do we move? And remember, he's thinking of Russia at a time when 95% of the population was illiterate, when the only theoretical anything that anybody ever saw was in the Russian Orthodox Church and within the framework of how that shaped the culture of this society. So imagine what he had to deal with, trying to hold on to the people who had a critical moment, had a critical insight for whatever complicated reasons. So he told them, no one knows how fast it goes. One last thing from me. I'm an economist. That's what I do. I look at the economy. I am not an alarmist, and I'm not a pessimist. I'm really more an optimist, and I'm really more been impressed most of my life that whenever I've seen a crisis of capitalism, and I've seen a lot of them, I've always said, okay, maybe if this happens, it can get out of this one. Or maybe if this opportunity arises, or maybe if this part of the world shifts. And mostly capitalism has been very resilient. It's been able to identify ways of getting out of its own dead ends. Having said that, I don't see it now. The accumulation of unresolved problems is overwhelming. The failure to handle this pandemic is a screaming index of a system that doesn't function. And the anger of people, the polling of young people that socialism, they barely know what it is something they find attractive. That tells you what they don't find attractive a bit more than it tells you what they do. But that's all, these are all profound signs. I don't see a way out. I really don't. Which means to me that Mr. Trump is a symptom of all of what I've just said. And so is the failure with the pandemic. And so is the inability to do anything but watch a global competitor, the People's Republic of China, simply outmaneuvering you at every turn. I could add, but for me, I think you ought to be aware that the demands on the American left are going to ratchet up alongside the opportunities for it in a way none of us could have foreseen as little as 4 or 5 years ago. That's how fast this stuff is now unraveling. I know,
Professor Wolff.
yeah.
Oh, sorry to interrupt you, but to that point.
I'm telling you,
Go ahead.
I keep telling you it's the last thing, and it isn't, and I apologize. I have coffee from time to time with my colleagues. My left-wing ones, my right-wing ones, and my in the middle. And because I went to all those elite, I got a lot of people that are to my right. Okay, and we don't agree on how we got into this situation. We don't, and we don't agree on how to get out of it. We don't. But let me tell you what blows my mind. With most of them, we agree on the following sentence, which we've gone around the table. This is the worst condition of the American economic system in our lifetimes. And I got gray hair. So my lifetime's a long time. And I'm telling you, no one is prepared. We all agree. We don't know what to do. We have our differences, but this is terrible, and it is getting more terrible. We've had 3 crises in this new century. The dot-com, so-called, in 2000, the subprime mortgage, so-called, 2008, and now the COVID-19. That's 3 crises, each worse than the one before in the first 20 years of a new century. You want evidence of a system in trouble? What are you asking for? It's all there if you're willing to see it.
Yeah.
Let me stop. Otherwise, I'll be
Well,
like
to that point, I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on a story that Politico broke this week, and it has to do with the role of Senator Bernie Sanders and how he could possibly have a position within Joe Biden's cabinet. Now, it appears as though, based on how this article was reported, Senator Sanders would like to serve as labor secretary in the Biden administration. And so there's a little bit of a debate happening right now as to where Senator Sanders would be more effective, as labor secretary in a Biden administration, or if he remains in the Senate, where if Democrats take control of the Senate, he could chair 2 important subcommittees, including the Senate Budget Committee and the Senate Subcommittee on Health. And so, you're weighing these options, trying to figure out where he could be the most effective. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that. What can he do as labor secretary under a Biden administration?
Well, this may not have been the answer you might have wanted from me, but to be honest with you, and what other point would there be? I think Mr. Biden has absolutely no interest and no use for Bernie Sanders beyond being able to say, as he has done increasingly recently, that he beat the socialists in order to assuage anyone's concern that he might be in some way amenable to giving Bernie any real authority or any real power. So, I mean, if Bernie were offered this, he might take it, but I think and I hope that he would take it in the spirit that if this is fraudulent, if this is an attempt to quote a certain kind of ethnic remark I shouldn't probably make, keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. Maybe Mr. Biden would like to keep Bernie quiet for fear of what he could do as an outside critic who already has a mass base. My instincts tell me, if I were Bernie, if he asked my advice, don't do this. Stay in the Senate, go after those committee positions if they are even possible or available. Given what I know about Mr. Schumer, I wouldn't be too hopeful there either. But nonetheless, if he can, good. But whether or not he can, he is a formidable foe outside. And if he uses that position, if he mobilizes, if he works, he can have at least as much influence on what finally happens as he could by being closer to the seat of power. Nothing in Mr. Biden's history gives me any reason to believe that he would allow Bernie any kind of latitude at all.
Nando, would you like to follow up on that?
Well, No, I mean, I've like my initial instinct was like, there's, it's a large federal bureaucracy that, someone like him with such a large political following, taking up that kind of position, it would be kind of unprecedented, certainly in recent times, and that, for any sort of labor organizing to happen to have an ally like that, not someone actively hostile to any labor organizing, it might help revitalize a little bit, or at least slow the trajectory and reverse it that we've been on of just like decline in labor density. But I could be wrong. But I guess my question to you, Professor, would be, I think that one of the things that you do so well, and why you've been such a inspiration to so many of us, is your plain spoken and confident arguments in favor of the things that you believe in. And I think that that's something that those of us that are younger members of the left, like, often kind of, we struggle with, where like, it's like, we don't have that, the decades of experience of fighting these fights, of having these arguments, and I think that the effect that you've had on millions of people through the work that you've done is to arm us with those kinds of arguments. And so I guess I would say, like, what would your best argument to sort of turn someone, for lack of a better term, into a Marxist, socialist, whatever you want to call it, be?
Well, I've always, again, to be very personal, I've always relied on my sustained interactions with people. Being a teacher in a classroom, you have every semester roughly 13 weeks. You meet with students twice a week or 3 times a week. That's a long time. And you can have an interaction, a relationship of talking about things. I can assign readings so that the reading is helps develop the arguments, provokes the questions, encourages the debates. And I have been confident and felt very good most of my life. Even during the whole Cold War period, as a professor, I was able to, my classrooms were full, the excitement was palpable. Even in the worst of the Cold War, with all the pejoratives around a critique of capitalism, let alone advocacy for something better, socialism, or whatever you want to call it, my students didn't find any of this very difficult. They just needed, I guess that's what you're telling me, they needed people to tell them it was all right. Human beings have critical feelings. You have criticism of your mother and father. You may not dare to articulate them even to yourself, but you sure have them. And if you go to therapy later in your life, you learn that it's healthy to be aware of them and to confront them and to try to cope with them and so forth. It's the same thing here with social criticism. That's why it's important that there are magazines like Jacobin. They're important that there are book clubs like Jacobin has set up. It's important to have all of this going on because it gives other people the confidence to ask those questions, to allow that in themselves that's already there to come out, to become conscious, to become explicit, to discover that there are other people who share this kind of thing. I had a conversation with a person very close to Bernie, and we both agreed, and I thought it was significant, that the most important thing that Bernie's 2 campaigns did was to teach people everywhere that they're not alone, that the millions who supported Bernie are exactly that, millions, and that there are millions more who could if they were given the confidence. Bernie, by standing up and being a nice old man who doesn't scare you or threaten your children or anything else that you thought might be involved in socialism, he was in some ways perfect. He was the kindly older fellow who made these interesting arguments and did it with a kind of charming passion that enabled people to get in touch with themselves, the parts of themselves that pushed in that direction and probably had through much of their lives but they hadn't yet come to terms with it. So again, I'm beating the drum. Don't stop. Keep doing it. It is, I think, the best hope we have, and it's working. It's working from below. In terms of Bernie himself, I don't know if you noticed, but over the last couple of weeks, there have been a number of central labor councils. I've noticed them in Seattle. I noticed one in Rochester, New York, who passed a resolution that if Trump was defeated but didn't leave, they would make a general strike in their community. Seattle, Rochester, Sarah Nelson, a really important labor leader in Washington, and for the people who work on the airlines, she has been advocating general strike to be used for political objectives for a good long while now. There's an interesting ability there to raise a question that has been taboo in the labor movement, namely a general strike. And not just a general strike about some economic issue, but a general strike about a political issue, so that the labor movement is re-entering the world of politics as something other than a support system for the Democrats.
Yeah. And, Joshua Kahn Russell is, leading that movement for a general strike if Donald Trump loses the election and refuses to leave office. And I think that's the right strategy. He's done a number of interviews about it, and he's going to be on the Young Turks this coming week to discuss it in detail as well. So please check out the wonderful work that Joshua Kahn Russell is doing. And as you know, he was a regular on the Michael Brooks show, along with you, Professor Wolff. That's how I learned about your work. And I have to be quite honest, the work that you're doing through Democracy at Work has really helped educate so many people, myself included, my husband included, who's the son of, Cuban refugees from the 1950s. So as you can imagine, he received a very different message from what you're putting out there. So I really do thank you for all the hard work, for your blunt honesty, and for taking the time to have this conversation with us today.
It's my pleasure. I support what you do. I'm happy that the Jacobin project got launched. Seems to me, again, evidence that there's an audience for what you are all doing, and that you're serving that audience in just the way. And again, I appreciate all the kind words, but you're doing what you're doing. That's what my generation, that's the best thing we can hear. So believe me, I'm as appreciative of you as you have been kind enough to say you are from me. And if you want to have a conversation again, just know I'll be as happy to do it in the future as I was this time.
I love it. Thank you so much. And take care.
You too. And thanks again for the opportunity.